Welcome to The Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore. Protests in the Sudan continues. The military, which had turned against Omar Bashir's government and protected the protesters from the presidential guard, has seized power. But they refuse to relinquish this power for the sake of a civilian government. Protesters flocked to the capital of Khartoum and intensify their demand for democracy. Against the deadly firearms used by the military, protesters are using paint and brushes and utilizing art as a means of resistance. Here is a clip of two graffiti artists who are contributing in their own way to the protests.
We assist the protesters with our weapon, which is the painting brush and color. That is what we can participate with, what we can use to express our feelings and involvement with the Sudanese people.
This is documentation. Documentation of history, documentation of my name, documentation of the revolution, and documentation of Sudan. If the uprising is not documented, then it becomes something that simply came and left. The coming generations will then not have a history because they will not know our history. We are documenting the history of previous generations, documenting the history of the martyrs who died, and documenting our history as fine artists.
Joining me to explain what's going on in Sudan is Professor Khalid Medani. He is an associate professor of political science and Islamic study, chair of the African Studies at McGill University. He wrote and edited a lot of articles on Sudan. Among his prolific writings on Africa, Arab, and Islamic political economy. Thanks for joining me, Professor.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me as your guest today. It's my honor.
Even though the military have made efforts to meet the demands of the protesters continue to set outside the military headquarters. Have this grown beyond the ability of the government to control it at this point?
I think so. I think that certainly the Transitional Military Council that has taken over has attempted to break up the sit-in in a variety of different ways, but they have been truly unsuccessful. Once again, because this is broad-based opposition. The protests include people from all over the country who have now participate in the sit-in and continue to participate in the sit-in. I think that they're trying to negotiate a soft landing for themselves, so to speak. But the reason the sit-in continues and will continue, and the opposition has made it very clear, is that their number one demand has not been met, and that is a demand of transition from the Transitional Military Council into a truly genuine transition to a civilian government that would oversee a transitional period leading up to multi-party elections. And so the reason that the Sudanese population continues to protest and continues to participate in the sit-in, remember now we're into the holy month of Ramadan, and the protesters are setting up their traditional iftar, or the breaking of the fast meal, in order to sustain these sit-ins and protests. And so until, as from the perspective of the opposition, of course, until the major demand of a transition to a civilian government from a military one is met, they have no intention of stopping the sit-in and returning to their homes, so to speak.
Is the reason that the military is reluctant to hand power over to civilians, is it that they might be afraid that Omar Bashir and other generals will be extradited to the International Criminal Court to stand trial over the war crimes committed during the Civil War, the war in Darfur?
Absolutely. That's one of their most important considerations. I think you make an excellent point. Absolutely. As I said before, the military council definitely has remnants of the previous regime. Not only Burhan, who is the head of the Transitional Military Council, who was very close to Omar Bashir and also participated in recruiting and soldiers to fight on the behalf, in support of the Saudi Arabian effort in Yemen, but also the vice the deputy of the Transitional Military Council, a man by the name of Hemeti, was a leader of something called the Rapid Support Forces, which is essentially a paramilitary force created by the former President al-Bashir to put down protests and opposition in Darfur and in the central part of the country, the Nuba Mountains and other locales, including protests in the past in Khartoum. And so one of the major reasons, you're absolutely right, is that if they were to give up power completely to a civilian government that is calling not only for a civilian government, but to the return of accountability, transparency, an independent judiciary, a rule of law, that al-Bashir and others who committed crimes in Darfur, war crimes, humanitarian crimes, or crimes against humanity, would be not only, if not forwarded to the International Criminal Court, they would have to face very stiff penalties within Sudan itself, since Sudanese are fully aware of the crimes that al-Bashir and his allies committed against many, many people in the country. So that's one very important aspect of why they're reluctant to give up power to a civilian government. Another one is simply also to maintain their privileges. This is a deep state that was built over 30 years. Many in the military have a great deal of wealth that they accumulated through a lot of shady and corrupt dealings. And those assets that they established over 30 years that are very important to them, not only al-Bashir and his brothers, but many in the upper ranks, not the lower ranks, but the upper ranks of the armed forces, would of course come under threat. Already, many Sudanese, the opposition has been calling not only for accountability, but for the returning of these assets that belong to the Sudanese people back to the population. Because most of this wealth was accumulated under the context of very corrupt deals, not only with within Sudan, but with patrons outside of the country, foreign powers outside of the country. So that is another really important reason why they don't want to give up power, because they feel that not only their own security, personal security, but also their financial privileges and economic privileges that they amassed under 30 years of authoritarian rule would be taken from them, and many of them, of course, would be held accountable for the crime of corruption that is something that they're very concerned about. Of course, their own discourse is a little bit different from that. They claim, of course, that they are concerned about the stability of the country, and of course, they have allies in the Gulf and elsewhere that are supporting them. And so their discourse, of course, is one to rationalize their continued hold on power by saying that it's only the military at this stage that would be able to maintain stability. But I would suggest to you and maintain very confidently that that's not the case. The only road towards stability for Sudan, we can see very clearly, is a genuine transfer to civilian, an accountable government that represents the voice of the millions of Sudanese that have been protesting.
Okay, you mentioned that they have allies in the region, and it seems that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are offering aid to the military and aid to the government. Why are they suddenly interfering into this situation in Sudan? And what are they trying to achieve? I understand Sudan already has troops supporting their war in Yemen. What else is involved here?
Well, Sudan, if you look at the map, is extremely geopolitically strategic and important. It, of course, borders the Red Sea, which is a very short trip to Saudi Arabia. It is also, of course, borders Egypt and Libya, and, of course, has real close connections to the Sahel region, across the Sahel region of Africa, and, of course, in the Horn of Africa itself, with Ethiopia and Eritrea on the eastern flank of the country. So strategically, it's very, very important. So there's a strategic interest on the part of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. They feel very strongly that their own interests are really influenced and in great part shaped in the region by a close alliance with a government in Sudan. And therefore, for decades, of course, they have supported and were supporting the regime of al-Bashir. Once he was ousted, they feel from their perspective that their own interests, economic, strategic, and financial, would only be secured with a close alliance with a military leader of the type that al-Bashir represented to them. That's a really important aspect of their strategic interest. Another aspect is that this is a coalition, essentially an alliance, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, an alliance that is in stiff competition geopolitically and regionally with the also wealthy and powerful country of Qatar that is in alliance with Turkey. So you have Sudan at the moment in the midst of geopolitical competition between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates that have strategic and financial interest in Sudan, and in competition, regional competition with Qatar and Turkey that also have very important economic, financial, and of course, geopolitical strategic interest in a country that is located in that part of the world. So this is the reason. There's also another important related reason, and that is that the example of a democratic government, a civilian government in Sudan, and in particular, a successful protest leading to democracy and overthrowing military rule or authoritarian rule, would, of course, set a precedent of, from their perspective of countries, I'm talking about the leadership, not the people, but countries such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, it would set a precedent from them of a potential kind of reverberation of a protest calling for human rights and a transfer to civilian democracy in their own countries. And that is something, of course, that threatens the leadership of these countries as well. So there are financial, economic, and geopolitical interests, but there are also these longer-term considerations that have to do with what would happen in the region to these countries if these millions of protesters in Sudan were able to not only overthrow an authoritarian military regime, but move towards civilian democratic government that represents the largest majority of the civil population in civil society. So if you take all of these together, you can see that there are great concerns. And this is why just recently, following the ouster of al-Bashir, reportedly, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia forwarded upwards of $3 billion US dollars of aid. I believe that that's an accurate number, but I'd have to check up on it again.
That number is what's been reported. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
So exactly where, I mean, there's protesters right now still outside the military headquarters. Exactly where is this whole thing right now today? And what if the protests are still pushing, what are they pushing for?
Right now, the sit-in that encompasses hundreds of thousands of people who've come from all over the country, not only the capital city of Khartoum, is in one of the most central parts of the capital city, essentially a very large square that is in front of the headquarters of the Sudan Armed Forces. And of course, as you know, they have been there now into their second month protesting and sitting in. And that is something that has been very important for the opposition, because the sit-in is the major kind of weapon they have, so to speak, to pressure the military council, the transitional military council, to negotiate with them in terms of transferring the governmental institution to a civilian government. And so where it stands at the moment is that there are negotiations between the main opposition under the umbrella of the Declaration of Freedom of Change. This is a very important umbrella organization, opposition, that includes the very important Sudanese Professional Association that has for the last upwards of 4 months, or now in the 5th month, that have been coordinating and orchestrating and organizing these very, very large protests, and other civilian, opposition, independent political parties, and 3 very, very important armed insurgent organizations that have been fighting the government for decades, states in Darfur and in the border regions with South Sudan. This opposition umbrella is negotiating with the Transitional Military Council on the structure of the interim civilian government to come. And the negotiations have been partly successful in the sense that the Transitional Military Council, after many days of being very reluctant to agree to a principal point, and that is that this opposition I just mentioned should be the sole representative of the opposition in the negotiations. Through the pressure of the sit-in, the Transitional Military Council, under the leadership of Burhan, accepted that this would indeed be recognized as a legitimate opposition and representative of the entire Sudanese population. Once that was recognized, the negotiations continued, but they became a little bit trickier, mostly because on the issue of the representation of the Transitional Council to come. Right now, the negotiations really have to do with the number of civilians and military personalities that would be in the Supreme Council, in the transitional government. And the opposition just yesterday forwarded a declaration, or rather a constitutional draft, to the Transitional Military Council with a number of important points, focusing on what the structure of the interim civilian government should be. And the declaration, or the draft declaration of this constitution, interim constitution, basically puts forth the proposition, or the demand rather, that there would be a sovereign Supreme Council made up of approximately 7 civilian leaders and 3 military leaders. In addition to that, there would be a second level of the interim government consisting of a council of ministers that would be appointed by the opposition, and there would be a legislative assembly or parliament that would represent the third branch of government. So the focus of the opposition now, through this draft constitution that they forwarded to the military council, is to focus on the structures and the balance of powers and authorities of the civilian government to come. It's very, very important to emphasize that. Another important point that I really would like to emphasize, because it's not often discussed in the media, and that is the number one demand, in addition to the structure of a civilian government on the part of the opposition, is an immediate cessation of hostilities and a resolution to what has been Sudan's biggest problem for the last 3 decades, and that is the civil conflicts that continue to really embroil Sudan in not only political and humanitarian crises, but also economic crises. These are the conflicts that you've heard about, I'm sure, in the western part of the country, in the Darfur region. Any interim government must address as a priority the resolution of these civil conflicts, and that the leaders of these armed insurgency organizations must be brought in as part of the civilian interim government. So this is where it stands at the moment. And what is happening as we're speaking right now is that the opposition and the entire Sudanese population, as a matter of fact, is awaiting the response on the part of the civilian, the military transitional council to these demands that I just outlined for you.
Okay, Professor, thanks for that update and that overview. And if things change, let's see if we can't come back and revisit this and talk about the new changes. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining The Real News.